satisfy your curiosity and maybe even your sweet tooth. We're diving into the fascinating world of chocolate, cacao, and your gut microbiome. So I'd like to introduce Benjamin Richardson. He's a nutritional therapy practitioner and lifelong semi-professional athlete. He specialises in supporting clients with body composition, exercise, cognitive performance, men's health, and overall health optimisation. Benjamin practices virtually through Programme Wellness and at the Healing Hub in Canary Wharf, London, working alongside mental health professionals to explore how diet and lifestyle influence both gut and brain health. In this talk, Cacao, Chocolate and the Microbiome, Benjamin will explore the science behind chocolate's health benefits, how it interacts with your gut bacteria, whether it can influence your cravings, and which types and doses deliver the best effects. So please join me in welcoming Benjamin Richardson.
Super. Now, unlike everybody else, I had to actually bribe Catherine to let me come here and talk about chocolate. So I get the easy task. I mean, I assume you're not here because you hate chocolate. Is anyone here because they hate chocolate? Okay, good. You're in the right place. So what I'm going to cover, which I'd say the ingredients of this session, is going to be, first of all, let's understand what is chocolate actually. Because we often use the term chocolate and chocolate bar in the UK to refer to things that are not chocolate. Secondly, what is it in chocolate which actually could be causing the positive health impacts? And of those, what do we take forward to say, not only do they have positive health impacts, but they do that through interaction with our gut microbiota? Because chocolate can have lots of different health effects, but I'm going to focus on the ones that actually have their effects through interaction with the bacteria in the gut. Then we say, so how does that work? How does cacao, cocoa and chocolate, and I'll define those three things in a moment, how do they interact with the gut bacteria? What happens next basically so that you as the human host get benefit from combining those two things? And then lastly, if you want to know very practically, if you want to get the maximum benefit from the chocolate or the cocoa that you consume, maximum benefit for you and your bacteria, where would you choose that chocolate from? What kind of chocolate would you choose? I've got that practical kind of steps at the end, and when I finish talking, if anyone would like to join me to sample some craft chocolate and even maybe listen to me say, well, here's how to do that, well, then you're welcome to join me. I think we'll just go to the back, we can break open the bar and enjoy it. So that's the reason to stay to the end of the talk, if nothing else, right? Okay, so we're going to start talking about what is chocolate and how is it made. And I think chocolate's absolutely beautiful. By the way, I'm just going to pass this around. So this is a cocoa pod, it's a dried out cocoa pod. If you've ever seen one of these, literally grow directly from the tree. So I'm just going to say pass this around and just feel it, just rub your hands over it to get the texture. So what's on screen now, and if you can't see this I will describe it. So there's basically 13 steps here involved in taking the cocoa pod from the tree, harvesting that and turning it into a chocolate bar at the end. And this would be, the 13 steps here would be taking it all the way from tree to bar. But some pictures to bring this to life. So this is a Theobroma cacao tree. So this is where you get the cocoa pods from. And it's the name of the small tree that produces them. And you notice, I think there's no other fruit, and cocoa pods are a fruit, which grow directly from the tree. So they're going to go directly from the trunk and the branch, rather than from our flowers. That's unique amongst fruit, I think. And these take about 5 to 6 months to actually mature on the tree. Now, this kind of shows off the wonderful rainbow of colours that you can get in cocoa pods. So that one there, which is being passed around, it's dried out, so it's brown, but they do come in browns, greens, yellows, reds, and this to some extent reflects the cocoa variety, but it also suggests what you're going to find inside when you open up these cocoa pods. You say, well, what treasures do we have inside? So let's open up a cocoa pod, not that one. I'm going to open one up on screen. So here's a really cool thing. When you open up a cocoa pod, when you hack it open, the first thing you're going to find is this kind of white, sticky, kind of pulpy substance, which is literally cocoa pulp. Now, this stuff actually surrounds the beans, which we then ferment and roast to make chocolate. But if you eat the pulp itself, it's like a tropical fruit. So it's very, very sweet, it's very, very flavoursome, it's very enjoyable, it's actually rich in vitamins and nutrients. And we throw this out, which is kind of a shame. It's actually used to enable the ferment, but then it usually gets discarded, which is a bit of a loss. And it's like one of these mysteries, which is, if you take the cocoa bean, which is hidden underneath the pulp, the cocoa bean is basically, it's rock hard, it's inedible. If you could bite through it, it's horrible. So you've got to ferment it and roast it and do a whole bunch of other things to it before it becomes nice chocolate. This stuff on the outside is lovely. So how did we ever figure out that we've got to get past this lovely stuff on the outside and use the rock hard nasty thing on the inside? I don't know how we figured that out. It's one of those mysteries. So once you've hacked open the, oh yeah, thank you. I'm getting back my cocoa pod. So once you've hacked this open, you've exposed the pulp. The key stage then in making chocolate is you ferment it. So chocolate is a fermented food. And you think about kefir over there, sauerkraut, kimchi. Chocolate is also fermented, and with coffee. And it's absolutely critical to the development of flavour and also the phytonutrient value that you get within cocoa and chocolate. And typically the pods will be fermenting for somewhere between 3 to 6 days. You've got an anaerobic stage without oxygen where yeasts consume the sugars in the pulp to produce ethanol. Then you've got an aerobic stage where you stir everything around to introduce oxygen, and then the bacteria basically consume the ethanol and convert that into acid, which begins to seep into the bean and then enable basically the bean to begin its journey of developing its flavour. If you don't do that, the bean is horrible. It's not very flavoursome at all, so you need this step to actually develop the chocolate flavour. And then you need to dry out the beans, because they're being coated in this kind of, this is where we throw out the pulp, unfortunately. You've had these beans and they've been fermented, they're all wet and they're hot, and you dry them out. And you dry them out typically, you can see here a good practice where they're being dried out on raised beds or mats. Sometimes they get dried out on the roadside, and that's bad, and I'll explain why later. It's how a lot of lead gets into chocolate. It doesn't need to be there. So at this point we've gotten to step 3. So we've harvested, we've fermented, we've dried it out, and this is the point at which most kind of cocoa beans will then be packed up into sacks and shipped to wherever the chocolate maker is that's going to make the chocolate. There are some tree-to-bar manufacturers that actually cover the whole process, and I'll hold one up. So for example, this craft chocolate maker called Richardson's, they own the plantation, so they do the whole process from step 1 to step 13, making the chocolate bar in one place effectively. But you get a lot more bean-to-bar makers, and has anyone heard the term bean-to-bar? Bean-to-bar on craft chocolate, bit of a marketing term, but what it indicates is that the maker is buying the beans at say step 5 here. So the beans have already been fermented and dried out and then supplied to the chocolate maker. After that, the process becomes something you could do in your kitchen, more or less, or in the factory. So you salt the beans to get rid of the ones which are a bit mouldy. You then roast them. So you roast the beans with the cacao nibs inside. Then you would crack open the beans so you can separate the husk from the cocoa nibs, which are on the inside. Then you would winnow, so that's winnowing, so separating the husk and the nibs. You would then grind the nibs, so you've got like a cacao liqueur, and you've got something which would begin to recognise as something you could maybe drink, but don't do it yet. Because the next thing is, depending on the chocolate you're going to make, you're going to then add other ingredients. So this would be this step here, step 10, and the other ingredients would hopefully just be as simple as a little bit of sugar. Maybe if you're making a milk chocolate, some milk powder. After that, we grind it or punch it, maybe for up to 48 hours, 72 hours to make it really velvety smooth. And at that point, we can do the really intense chemistry work. Oh, has anyone ever tempered chocolate at home? Okay, unless you want literally a day-long project where you've got to raise the temperature, lower the temperature, raise the temperature again, and then use it really quickly. It's a lot of work. But that's how you make chocolate which is tempered well, so it will be shelf-stable, and when you break it open, you'll have a nice clean snap, which is one of the hallmarks of craft chocolate, which I'll talk about later. And then you've got a chocolate bar, like these ones here, which you'll have access to later. So the next slide is going to look absolutely really, really busy, because I'm going to ask the question, what is it in chocolate that could have health benefits for us? And it's lots of different things. It's really complex, but I'll just point to 5 of them. So when you break down any food into its actual components, it's always like a long, long list of chemistry. So chocolate's no different. But the key things that relate to chocolate's potential health benefits are the following. So one, it's actually really, really rich in minerals. So if you were to eat 100 grams of cocoa solids, you would actually fulfill your recommended daily intake for iron, magnesium, manganese and phosphorus, and you'd make very good progress on your recommended daily intake for copper, zinc and potassium as well. you'd also be consuming about 800 calories, but let's forget about that bit for now. You probably heard this one up here, alkaloids, otherwise known as methyl xanthines. So the main stimulant in chocolate is theobromine, which has some similarities with caffeine, and there is some caffeine in chocolate. The theobromine, if you look at caffeine and you see like you get like a big peak in kind of perceived additional energy with caffeine, theobromine has got a much more gentle peak to it. But chocolate does have a little bit of both. Certainly this compound has a lot of health impacts, but not through the gut, not through the microbiome, so I'm not going to be talking much about theobromine. It's definitely very relevant, but not when we were focused on bacteria. And the same with the minerals. So then we've got fatty acids in chocolate, and the main fatty acids in chocolate are stearic acid, palmitic acid, and oleic acid. And all I'm going to say about them is that these appear to have a neutral impact upon your blood cholesterol. So neither positive nor negative, maybe a little bit positive. There is some evidence that these fatty acids reduce your low density lipoprotein, or often gets misrepresented as BANT cholesterol. But it might also protect some of those low density lipoproteins or bad cholesterol from being oxidized, which is definitely bad. So if anything, these might have a mildly positive effect. But the thing that I'm definitely going to be kind of taking through to, here's where chocolate interacts with your gut microbiome to give you benefits, are fiber and polyphenols. First of all, fiber. Chocolate is an incredibly high fiber food. In fact, when I was doing preparation for this, I couldn't actually find another food which had as much fiber per 100 grams. So per 100 grams, chocolate, so 100% cocoa solids, it's got somewhere between 8 and 18 grams of fiber. For a few points of comparison, if you talk about whole wheat bread, it's got about 4 grams of fiber per 100 grams. Talk about, say, broccoli or Brussels sprouts, they've got, let's say, 3 or 4 grams per 100 grams. Pumpkin seeds, really high in fiber, they've got about 6 or 7 grams. So chocolate's beating all of them. I'm being unfair, because I'm doing it on a gram basis. If I did it on a calorie basis, it wouldn't work out quite so well. But chocolate is still a really, really high fiber food, and that's actually one of the big reasons why chocolate can have a health effect, by literally giving you dietary fiber in a really tasty way. But the real star of the show, and what I'll kind of major on for the rest of this talk, is going to be the polyphenols. So, or polyphenols, depending on how you like to pronounce it, because this is where chocolate is basically a superstar. One more really complex slide to introduce this concept of polyphenols. So, if I just helicopter for a moment and say, we probably have heard of macronutrients. So your macronutrients would be your protein, carbohydrate, fat, sometimes arguably fiber and alcohol. And these are macro because we have a lot of them. One level down from macronutrients will be micronutrients. So here we're talking about vitamins, minerals, essential fatty acids, amino acids. One level beneath that is phytonutrients. Now it says here phytochemicals, different term for exactly the same thing. Chemical sounds a bit scary, and nutrient sounds nice. There isn't any recommended daily intake for phytonutrients. And what we do know about them is that they have enormous health impacts, and largely positive. And they have those kind of impacts through two ways. Some of it, the compounds themselves are directly health beneficial for the human, but they're also sometimes mildly toxic. But then the body's reaction to that toxin is so powerful that they become a net benefit for us. So they're bad to eat if you, like, say, you're an insect or you're a very small creature, but when you're a large human with a complex physiology, you can basically get a lot of benefit from them. And this central channel here basically shows what chocolate is really, really high in. So it's very high in polyphenols, of which flavonoids, of which flavanols and flavanols. This gets really complicated, by the way. It's almost, I like the analogy between this, and if you start looking at the names of different bacteria, they're about the same level of complexity. But here's how good chocolate is. I think we've probably heard that berries have a lot of good nutrition in them. They're very rich also in polyphenols. But if I just draw your attention to cocoa powder down the bottom here, and cocoa powder is basically just almost 100% cocoa solids, with nothing else, with no sugar, with very little cocoa butter. So if we rank all these different foods, and you see most of these are berries, there's a peanut here, and there's one of the standout rye and wheat bran, but most of these is like the world's best berries. And we're ranking them against cocoa powder in terms of their polyphenol value. And you can see there's only one berry in the world which has a higher polyphenol count than cocoa powder. And I bet it's a berry that no one's ever heard of. So has anyone heard of chokeberry here? No. Has anyone ever had a chokeberry? No. No. If I said aronia berry? Still no. No. Okay. Yeah, you can't really get them in the UK. This is what they look like, and this is not black and white, by the way. This is what they look like when they're dried. You can buy them in the UK, dried, and I've done this, and you can rehydrate them and eat them, and they're bitter and not very nice. Whereas cocoa is pretty nice. So cocoa is absolutely amazing. You might be saying, okay, but what about dark chocolate, which is at the top here and not so high? But dark chocolate, at least according to say UK and EU food regulations, so long as you've got just 35% cocoa solids in your product, you can call it dark chocolate. So the other 65% is going to be sugar, maybe milk, maybe vegetable fat, maybe palm fat, and that doesn't contribute anything in terms of polyphenols. So this is like really unfair. This is like, what if you take, say, a raspberry, but you put it into a pavlova? Well, yeah, then the raspberry wouldn't be here. The raspberry pavlova would be up here, like having almost nothing. So this is the one to look at. Chocolate is absolutely amazing in terms of its polyphenol content. And why does this matter? So polyphenols are a big part of the story for why cocoa and chocolate can be really, really health supporting. There's a lot of research, and I'll very, very briefly kind of touch on it, which looks at the relationship between cocoa, chocolate, and insulin sensitivity, which you would want to avoid pre-diabetes and diabetes, reduce your chronic inflammation, help support your natural production of enzymes, which help you digest food, stimulate appropriate fat metabolism so you can use fat for energy and not just rely upon carbohydrate and glucose, and also be a direct antioxidant. But again, none of those have an interplay with the gut bacteria. So what I'm going to focus on soon now is how does all that happen via your gut bacteria. So what is it that chocolate does for your gut bacteria to do favours for you? So briefly first, I'll just do a bit of a summary of what is the actual evidence for health benefits from consuming cocoa and chocolate. I mean, is there any evidence? Or is it just marketing? Because it could just be marketing. But there is actually quite a lot of evidence that's gone into looking at what could cocoa and chocolate consumption in the kind of quantities and the types of chocolate which you could reasonably actually consume in real life, what can that really do for you? So first of all, with relation to cardiovascular disease, there is evidence that regular consumption, we're talking about, let's say, 25-30 grams a day of very, very dark chocolate, can potentially reduce your blood pressure by somewhere between 3 to 5 points, which is definitely clinically valuable, clinically meaningful. And it might also reduce your oxidized low-density lipoproteins, the so-called bad cholesterol. So there's some evidence that chocolate can actually be helpful for heart health. Secondly, I'll just touch on type 2 diabetes. So again, there's a little bit of evidence that consuming cocoa with very dark chocolate can reduce the development of insulin resistance, and therefore also inflammation with people that already have diabetes. So there's something there. A little bit more exciting maybe is there is evidence with relation to cognitive function that chocolate can actually improve two things. Attention. Does anyone remember when we had attention? Like if we go back like 10-15 years before smartphones, we could pay attention to something for more than 30 seconds. Yeah, I remember that. So I'm not saying that chocolate can solve that problem, but it can actually support improved attention and also mood and recall, memory recall. On aging, okay, so there's a bit of evidence that regular consumption of cocoa and chocolate can actually improve some markers of skin health, particularly protection from ultraviolet light, and also improved hydration in the skin. So, hey, it could make you look better. With regards to kind of weight control or obesity, no major effect. So that's still positive, because it means actually you're not seeing people put on fat or weight as a result of eating chocolate. So at the very least, there's an absence of a negative, which is a good thing. With regards to cancers, there's basically just very limited evidence that it has any effect. But then we get on to the bit which is the focus of the rest of my talk, which is what does chocolate do to intestinal health, so your gut health. And this is where it gets really interesting, because here you see there's some direct impacts upon your gut bacteria, but then there's also the second order effect. Is in, first of all, cocoa and chocolate does something with your gut bacteria, and then they do things for you. Okay, so at this point I think I can move on to saying what do they do. Before I do that, I'll just say, I'll give you the caveat. which is that some of the criticisms of the research into cocoa, chocolate and health is that a lot of the research has very small groups of people, somewhere between 20, 30, 40, 50 people only, rather than like big populations. Some of the studies are very short, maybe days or weeks. Most of them are industry funded. Not necessarily a problem. A lot of research, especially with food, is industry funded. That's not by itself a problem. It means you might want to be skeptical. I mean, you want to be kind of like quizzical, and you want to ask questions. That's better than being cynical. So if you just dismiss it, the research because it's industry funded, you're dismissing most research, frankly. Sometimes these studies also use like very, very specially prepared like injections of cocoa, which you're not going to get and use yourself. But if you would actually ask me, if we assess the body of evidence for health benefits of cocoa and chocolate, is it just pure marketing and hyperbole? Is it promising but it's like very early stage? Is it probable that there's benefits here, or is it absolutely certain? My take would be it's probable that there are benefits from eating cocoa and chocolate. And the reason I would say that is there's very credible mechanisms of action, meaning there are biological pathways which we could expect chocolate and cocoa to exert positive effects via. So the fact that those exist and then we also see positive effects is a really strong signal. And yes, a lot of the studies are small, but some of those studies have really good controls, like they have human randomized control trials, the gold standard of looking to see where you've got cause and effect. And you've also got some repetition and consistency of findings. So rather than it being small one-off studies, which find something interesting, you've actually got studies finding the same things over and over again. So that repetition is really important in science, and we see that with the research into cocoa and chocolate. So the main story here is, how does chocolate play with our gut bacteria in order to give us human host benefits? So the first thing to point out here is, remember those two properties of chocolate which I mentioned, which are related to health benefits and gut bacteria? One, fiber, and two, polyphenols. Well, when we consume these polyphenols, so the phytonutrients found in basically richly coloured plant foods, we as the human are very, very bad at absorbing those. Meaning if you eat chocolate that's rich in polyphenols, you as the human can only actually really absorb about 5 to 10% of that polyphenol value. And you might know that, who's walked through the giant gut, by the way, already? A few people, okay. So when you get to the small intestinal part, that is where almost all of your human nutrient absorption takes place. So if we talk about vitamins and minerals and carbohydrate and proteins and fats, almost all that gets absorbed within the small intestine. But you'll only absorb about 5 to 10% of polyphenols that you eat, which means that they continue through the giant gut and they get into the large intestine, which is the home for most of your bacteria. And so basically when you eat food which contains polyphenols, you're basically just serving up a meal to the bacteria in your large intestine. So they get to eat what you don't. And then here's where the magic happens. So gut bacteria, when you give them these polyphenols, that's their food, so they will eat that. And then they produce what's called metabolites, which basically is the product of metabolism. So they produce things for you after you give them their food. So they'd say, hey, thank you, and we'll do some stuff for you now. It's quid pro quo. Also, and here's the really powerful thing, whenever you're feeding your microbes food through fiber or polyphenols, you're also influencing their future development. So if you give them, for example, the particular polyphenols that are found, so the catechins, epicatechins, the procyanates, and those are just complex science words, but those are the particular kind of flavonols which are highest in cocoa and chocolate. When you give this food regularly to your gut bacteria, the gut bacteria which like that food will proliferate. And the ones that don't like that food will shrink in proportion. So cocoa and chocolate can actually shift the population of your gut bacteria towards a population which is more helpful for you as the human. So not only do you give the bacteria food and they make good things for you, you're also shifting your gut bacteria population to one which is more host beneficial rather than host harmful. It's actually the big way in which eating cocoa and chocolate, you do yourself a favour by doing your bacteria a favour. And then what do we see from this outcome? So at the high level, we see the outcome of what the bacteria do for you after you give them their polyphenols We see reduced chronic inflammation. Now we need inflammation. We need inflammation to fight infections and viruses and bacteria which invade us, but we don't want high inflammation all the time. So we see the metabolites which bacteria produce for you when you give them chocolate and cocoa reduces inflammation. We do see reduced cardiovascular disease risk. We do see improved immune function, and someone you might have heard already that about 70% of the immune system is around your gut, the enteric immune system. Also neuroprotective, and they've got a double action. So I mentioned earlier on that there's some cardiovascular protection effect through reducing blood pressure, and the really cool thing is that cocoa and chocolate does that in two ways. So after about 2 hours after you eat cocoa or chocolate, you might get a reduction in your blood pressure, and that's because the circulating flavonols are basically stimulating the release of nitric oxide, or NO, which then dilates your blood vessels so there's lower pressure, even if they're a little bit wider. And that happens about 2 hours after eating cocoa or chocolate. But then you also get that about 6 to 8 hours later. And that's because at that point, your bacteria have finished digesting their meal, and they're producing metabolites which basically have the same effect. So in other words, you get the human effect, and then later on you get the bacteria effect. But they do the same thing in terms of dilating blood vessels and lowering your blood pressure, which is one of the main ways in which they can help reduce cardiovascular disease risk and atherosclerotic plaques. Okay, I'm now going to try and blind you with science for like a few slides. I'm just cherry picking some human randomized controlled trials, so again the gold standard evidence for cause and effect, to show what happens when we actually have a group of people, maybe like this group of people here, and we administer you through a controlled trial and give you cocoa or chocolate. What happens? What can we learn from that? So here's number one. So we're not Japanese maybe here, but maybe we could extrapolate this to say it isn't just for Japanese females. So this study looked at 31 healthy female Japanese participants, and they were either consuming 25 grams of very dark chocolate or the same amount of white chocolate. And by the way, white chocolate doesn't actually have any cocoa solids in it at all. It's only got cocoa butter, so it doesn't have any of the stuff which would come with the polyphenols, basically. So they had this dose for 2 weeks, and here's what they found. The dark chocolate group only, so not the white chocolate group, had an increase in their gut bacteria diversity. And diversity in gut bacteria, and it saves it in the giant gut over there, it's a good thing almost always to have more diversity rather than less diversity, so more different types of bacteria. So they found that the dark chocolate group got that increased diversity after 2 weeks. Second thing, and I'm a nutritionist so I'm allowed to talk about this stuff, increased frequency of bowel movements. So I think this group of Japanese females initially, they were on 2.4 bowel movements per week on average, and they went up to about 3 on average. That's meaningful, that's helpful, it indicates you've got more gut motility, things are moving through, that's very often helpful. And that was through a combination of the fibre and the polyphenols. And then, complicated words, can I pronounce them? This is the first study showing that when they were taking this dark chocolate, gut bacteria which are associated with host-benefit effects, they grew in population, and ones associated with negative effects shrunk in population. So there was a positive shift in the gut microbiota. So Faecobacterium, Megamus, and Rosaburia, I don't know if actually that's how you pronounce it correctly. It's not really needed. These are all butyrate producers. Butyrate is a short-chain fatty acid. And short-chain fatty acids, basically, they help, within the gut, they help decrease your transit time through the gut, which means you can have more bowel movements. And they stimulate the thing called peristalsis, which is basically the contraction of the smooth muscle, which moves things through the tube from here to the other end. So it's a good thing. Okay, study number 2, 48 healthy participants. By the way, it's important that these kind of studies get done on healthy people. Because when they're done on people that, for example, are living with obesity or maybe living with diabetes, the results are interesting, but not necessarily something which will be true for people that don't live with obesity or don't live with diabetes. So it's important that these are done on healthy people. So 48, they were using a specially prepared cacao powder. Sorry, I just said cacao. It should say cocoa here. So I'll just mention briefly, cacao just refers to before it's roasted. So the things I was showing up on screen at the earlier, and that pod here, this is cacao, right? Once it's roasted, it's cocoa or chocolate. And there's no such thing as raw chocolate really, and I'll explain why if anyone wants me to explain why. If anyone tries to sell you raw chocolate, don't trust them. Okay, so specially prepared cocoa powder. And again, what they found here, and this is after I think it was 2 or 3 weeks, is the same thing as in study number 1. So an increased proportion of bifidobacterium, rosaburia again, and lactobacterium, these short-chain fatty acid producers, and the ones that produce anti-inflammatory metabolites for you as a human. And a decreased proportion of these Parabacteroides, Doria, and Ulstipes, which are, it's okay to have them in your gut, but if you have more of them, potentially it's problematic because these things produce pro-inflammatory metabolites, so they raise your level of inflammation. So generally, you want to have a balance in your gut of more of the positive health impacting bacteria. Okay, study number 3, 48 again, nice number. Now, this time, really interesting. I love this study because it begins to answer the question of if you want to choose chocolate and cocoa, which is more likely to have a positive effect for you, it begins to answer the question of what type. Because here they actually gave these participants 3 weeks either 30 grams of 85% chocolate or 30 grams of 70% chocolate. And they were saying, well, does this make a difference? And what they found was, yes, it does. So they only for the group consuming 85% chocolate and not for the 70%. Again, they found that phenomenon, and it should be familiar by now, of improved gut bacteria diversity. And again, they got the positive shift in what kind of bacteria were actually there. They also found in this study improved mood, both from the absence of low mood but the presence of positive mood, but only for the people consuming the 85%. There's a few potential reasons for that. One of them might be they just weren't getting a high enough dose of the polyphenols and the fibre, because if you have 70%, you're having less cocoa solids. It could also be because of a potential negative impact of what the 30% is. So if the 30% is added sugar, then that could be exerting a negative impact, which is then counteracting or counterbalancing the positive impact. So you kind of work out neutral. But this is the one study I know of which is actually showing 85% works and 70% doesn't. Last study, I promise. Unless you say you want more studies. Last study, I promise. Wait, no, this is the last study. Okay, so this is the last study, and this is the one I really like because I am a lifelong athlete. It was mentioned by at the beginning, and I overtrain. So I ridiculously overtrain. I exercise way too much, and that's very harmful for gut health because it creates a lot of stress. It creates a lot of oxidative stress, and when you have a lot of oxidative stress through any source, what can happen is that in your small intestine, you should have basically these things. You should have a nice kind of tight lining in the small intestine, so that nutrients can get through to your blood circulation, so your liver can process them and you can absorb them, but nothing else should get through. So viruses shouldn't get through, bacteria shouldn't get through, undigested food particles shouldn't get through. But what can happen is, has anyone heard of the thing called leaky gut? Yeah? It's basically where these junctions, where the cell lining is not functioning correctly and bad things can get through, and drive up inflammation. Athletes, especially elite athletes or long distance athletes or endurance athletes, often get this leaky gut phenomenon. So in this study, if you're into sport, they took these elite athletes, elite soccer players. I call it soccer because I'm more American than British. Real football used to wear body armour is what I think. So they gave these 24 elite athletes 85% again, cocoa or a placebo. Oh, that's disappointing. For 30 days. And what they found was that the people getting the actual dose, the real cocoa, the chocolate, decreased their intestinal permeability. So in other words, they had a better functioning small intestine compared to the athletes which didn't. So they were both training equally hard, but only people that were getting this dark chocolate actually got the gut protection effect. Now there's one other way, which I haven't talked about yet, in which dark chocolate in particular might be health positive. And it's simply this. What if you're just avoiding a negative? So the stuff on the right is apparently the top 30, is it, or 25 most popular puddings or desserts in the UK. Does anyone recognise their own favourite desserts on screen? You recognise it? Who else? If your hands up, if you recognise your favourite dessert on screen. Oh, so not everyone does. Okay, hands up if your favourite dessert is sticky toffee pudding. You're all wrong. Okay, you're right. Yes, thank you. I'm also right. Sticky toffee pudding is the best of all possible desserts, you see. But one of the reasons which chocolate might be health positive is simply that if you come to the end of your, say, evening meal and then you want something which is a treat, one option you could have is you have maybe 2 or 3 squares of very dark chocolate which you're mindful about and you savour and you let it melt in the mouth and get the flavour journey. And then you probably won't want any more because it's very satiating, it takes a long time and it lingers in the mouth for a long time. Option 2 could be you have something like what's on the right hand side where one, it's basically just sugar. So the first ingredient, every single thing on the right is sugar, and sometimes it's combined with a lot of, say, butter or vegetable fat. So it's not got any of the health benefits of chocolate. Also, it's probably what we call a bliss point in terms of how pleasurable it is. So you're likely to eat a lot more of it. So you're eating more of the added sugar. So in other words, the thing on the right might be harmful for your gut bacteria, whereas the thing on the left, at worst, it's neutral. So one of the things that like very dark chocolate can do for you is just displace something which is much, much worse, even if it isn't doing good things, and it is probably doing good things based upon all of the evidence. So as a summary, what can cocoa and chocolate do for you by your gut bacteria? One is it can improve diversity in your gut. 2 is it can improve the profile of the bacteria which you actually host. 3 is it can support that your small intestine functions well, rather than being leaky. 4, it can support more regular bowel movements, good thing. 5, it can actually support the production of health-supporting metabolites. So your gut bacteria actually produce things like neurotransmitters and hormones, which is how they communicate with the brain. So you let the brain know, feel good, have a good mood. And 6, it can displace foods with more negative health outcomes. Now, I was going to talk about how chocolate can interact with your gut bacteria to tell you, the human, what to do. Because, I'll do it really briefly. But if you find this fascinating, come and talk to me afterwards. I'm also going to, I'll mention it now. After this talk finishes and we do Q&A, if you want to come and experience some craft chocolate with me, you're just going to go to the back and we can eat some together. So very briefly, I've been talking about how cocoa and chocolate impact your gut bacteria and then how the bacteria give you benefits. And you might think, okay, so you might be motivated now to eat chocolate to get those benefits. But what if your gut bacteria are motivated and then they give you that instruction? Now that might sound bonkers, but actually they might be doing that. So this is only in mice. Mice are not humans, fine. But there's this experiment where they took a group of mice and divided them into 3. And these were what's called germ-free mice. So they had no gut bacteria, they were sterile. And then these mice were given gut bacteria transplants from other mice. So one group of mice got bacteria from herbivore mice, so they're purely plant-based. One group of mice got bacteria transplant from carnivore mice, that own animal foods, and the last one got like a mixed transplant. And then they let this bacteria settle into the mice. They gave them like 7 days to figure out what the heck's going on, and then they gave them options. What diet do you want to follow? So the mice basically just were able to choose their own diet. And it was basically either a high protein or high carb diet, or a low protein or low carb diet. And what was found was that there was a very significant difference based upon the microbiome that had been transplanted into these mice. And so we can say from this, the only variable for these mice was the gut bacteria. They were genetically identical, they lived in the same environments, they had the same food choices, and they started making different choices based upon what bacteria they had. So we can extrapolate from this and say, well, what if that's also the same for humans? So what if, and this isn't really a what if the bacteria that we have in our small intestine, large intestine, can actually communicate to the brain? The thing is, we know this can happen already. So your gut bacteria in your gut basically have 3 or 4 ways in which they can communicate to your brain. One of them is through stimulating your immune system to produce different pro or anti-inflammatory cytokines, which then travel through bloodstream, pass the blood-brain barrier, and give a signal to your brain to do something or not do something. They've got a direct neural pathway, so gut bacteria can actually produce neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin and gamma-aminobutyric acid, which then can travel through circulation, get to the brain and exert an effect. They've also got a really, really cool way through producing metabolites, which has anyone heard of the vagal nerve or the vagus nerve? So the vagus nerve basically is a nerve which runs effectively from your intestine to your brainstem, And your gut bacteria can again produce metabolites which send a signal to the vagus nerve, which then signals to your brainstem. So they've got at least 3 ways of communicating directly to your brain. And what they might be communicating is, hey, that chocolate stuff, we like it, give us more. And seriously, this definitely happens in terms of appetite. Whether it happens specifically for cocoa and chocolate, we don't really know, but they can definitely influence your food choices. That's not in doubt. And that would be really cool. It'd be like a partnership. And then if you ever want to eat chocolate, you justify it to somebody else, you can just say, well, it's not me, it's my gut bacteria, they're relying upon it. Okay, getting to the practical, if you're convinced by this, and you say, well, this seems like a good idea, Benjamin's been very convincing, how would you choose the best chocolate to get the most benefit? So here comes the really practical part. Because how chocolate is made and where it's sourced from has a big impact upon the residual fibre and particularly the polyphenol value, which is what gives you these benefits. And unfortunately, almost all the stages of cocoa production reduce the polyphenol count. So the one thing you can do within the process to improve the polyphenol count is making sure that the cocoa pod is ripe. And any producer of craft chocolate, like my favourite here, it's a French brand called Le Pralas. They will be working directly with the farmer to make sure that they're planting the cocoa in an appropriate way, they're supporting it, and they're harvesting it only when it's ripe rather than when it's unripe. Whereas if you get involved with what I would call big chocolate, where they're driven by schedules and enormous supply chains, they've got a lot less ability to make sure that they're only harvesting when it's ripe. So that's stage 1. And then every other stage beyond that, fermenting, drying, roasting, sorting, all have the potential to reduce the polyphenol count of chocolate. So here I'm basically going to make a case for craft chocolate over what I would call big chocolate or mass market chocolate. Because with mass market chocolate, when they get to the roasting stage, what they'll often do is they'll already crack open the cacao bean and throw away the husk and roast the nibs directly. And when they do this, they destroy a lot more of the polyphenol value than if you roast the nibs inside the bean. So any craft chocolate maker will roast the whole bean, and then after they've roasted, they'll crack open the bean and they'll separate the husk from the bean. But what some big chocolate makers do, and some of them, they're not very transparent about it, but you can see it sometimes, is they crack open first and then they roast, which destroys a lot more of the polyphenol value. Another thing which big chocolate will often do, and it's not even on this step, on this 13 stages, it's not necessary, is they'll do something called Dutching or alkalizing, which is basically where they take an alkaline and they immerse the cocoa nibs in this alkaline solution, which basically helps reduce the acidity, it helps reduce the bitterness of the chocolate, and it gives it a slightly richer colour. But in doing so, they're also killing up to 60 to 70% of the polyphenols by alkalizing. And you can, if you pick up like a chocolate bar, you'll very often see that it will say something like, this is Dutch, or it's alkalized. It will very often declare that. That kind of chocolate has a much, much lower polyphenol value than craft chocolate, and craft chocolate is almost never alkalized or Dutched. So that's number 2. And then when you get to the point of adding ingredients, well, I mean, this might seem obvious, but anything you add is going to have much lower health supporting benefits than the cocoa solids themselves. So it's okay to add a little bit of sugar, it's okay to add a little bit of milk, but if that's actually most of what the end product, then at that point you've diluted the cocoa solids to the point where you're not actually getting a meaningful dose, which is why we see things like in that 85% versus 70% study that only the 85% was actually getting a meaningful benefit. And here's an example. If I just put, so ignore the different colours, if you just say 70%, this is the potential impact of roasting on the polyphenol count. You're basically saying that between roasting at 120 degrees Celsius versus 150 degrees Celsius, the difference is about 70%. So in other words, if you roast at a low level, you'll lose a lot less polyphenols than if you roast at 150 degrees centigrade. And again, big chocolate tends to roast higher for shorter periods. And you do need to roast. This is why I say there's no such thing as raw chocolate. You need to roast the chocolate to kill the harmful microbes that are otherwise going to be in the cocoa beans and the nibs. But you don't need to roast for as long. Again, a craft chocolate maker won't roast for as long. I won't run this as a quiz. I'll just say that this is from left to right, white chocolate, milk chocolate, dark chocolate, and maybe the following will be shocking. If we say by UK and EU food regulations, how much cocoa solids needs to be in your white chocolate, it's 0. In fact, that's the requirement. You have cocoa butter in it, which is just the fat, no cocoa solids at all. So unfortunately, none of the good stuff. Milk chocolate, the legal requirement to be able to call it chocolate for it to be milk chocolate is just 25%, which means you can have up to 75% just milk powder, sugar, palm fats, all much, much cheaper than cocoa and chocolate, which is a big reason for like your Toblerone and your Mars and your Nestle to put them in, because it's a lot cheaper. Dark chocolate, okay, I will ask this other question. So what should be the minimum percentage to call something dark chocolate? Who thinks it's at least 85%? No. Who thinks it's at least 70%? No. Who thinks it's at least 50%? A few people. Who thinks it's at least 40%? Keep your hands up. Okay, at least, no, it's none of those. 35%, if you have just 35% cocoa solids, you can call your product dark chocolate. Again, that means the rest of it can be sugar. And probably will be, because sugar is very cheap. So, for example, and by the way, you might see that bar on screen. Actually, it's this one here. It's very similar anyway, same maker. So if you buy craft chocolate like this, typically you'll just see like 2 or 3 ingredients, cocoa, sugar, and an emulsifier, which is not a bad thing, to help make the chocolate stable. Lindt, excellent, except they're not excellent at all. Look at the first ingredient in this dark chocolate. Why don't they call it a sugar bar? Why don't they call it a sugar bar? They call it dark chocolate. I don't know why. And I don't know what androgynous milk fat is. I do actually, but it's not worth now. Fun thing, so last year, 2024, there was a big consumer reports published on the presence of lead and cadmium within chocolate. And Lindt came out really, really badly in that. Lots of lead and cadmium, which is very, very bad, very, very harmful to health. And a group of US consumers are now taking Lindt to court saying, hey, how can you claim excellence when you've got all this lead and cadmium, which is poisonous? And literally the Lindt legal defense is, oh, it's just a marketing term, there's nothing to it. Our chocolate is not actually excellent, we just like to say that for marketing. And yeah, now here's where I'm fully American. So that thing on the right, in the UK, we're bonkers. We call that chocolate, or we call it a chocolate bar. Where's the chocolate? Sugar, glucose syrup, peanuts, skim milk powder, cocoa butter, that's not chocolate, cocoa mass. It's only when we get to the cocoa mass, like ingredient number 6, that there's any cocoa solids. In the US, they're smarter than us. No, on this they are. They would call that a candy or a candy bar. Much more accurate term. This is chocolate. This is not much chocolate, that's not chocolate at all. So here's the cheat list if you want to have the best possible chocolate for you and your bacteria. So number 1, cocoa solids, higher is better, but because of the roasting, because of the fermentation, it's not the end of the story. So point number 2 is craft is better, because they're going to be working with the people that grow the chocolate to make sure it's the best possible chocolate. They're going to be working all the way through the supply chain, because this is how craft chocolate makers actually thrive. They live and die on the flavour, and then people are buying it again. By the way, if you want the very best in craft chocolate, there's a blue flyer down there. There's a chocolate fair coming up on 11-12 October. It's free to attend. That's where you'll find the good stuff. Non-Dutch is better. And if you are going to buy mass market chocolate, which does have the advantage of being cheaper, just find one which is non-Dutch or non-alkalized. Same thing, different term. If it doesn't say that on the wrapper, it doesn't say that on the label, you can usually just go on Google and say, like, is green and black Dutch, is Montezuma Dutch, and they usually will have an FAQ which tells you that, and if it's Dutch, it's going to be much, much lower in the polyphenol count. Lead and cadmium, less is better. I mean, lead, you might know, is just harmful for human health, but it's also very harmful for bacterial health. So if you're consuming more lead, you get a lot lower bacterial diversity. You also get increased leaky gut, you get decreased short-chain fatty acids. So feeding lead to your gut bacteria, they don't like it, just like you don't like it. So avoiding lead and cadmium is better. I'll show you how to do that. And the dose that you're looking for here is, just like in those studies, somewhere between 20 to 30 grams of as dark as you can enjoy. So 100%, 85%. There's ways to do it, I promise you. That's your prescription for the best possible chocolate and cocoa for you and your gut bacteria. I mentioned this consumer report, and I want to point this out because a lot of the brands which you recognise here are the ones which we might love, And you can go and read all this online. So the whole data which Consumer Reports produced to look at the lead and cadmium in chocolate is all available. It's all public. It was a bit of a shock. Now they do have these choices on the left, which are the better chocolates with lower lead and cadmium. By the way, there's lead and cadmium in pretty much all food, so it's not just chocolate. It's estimated that even if you're eating chocolate every day, only about 4% of your lead and cadmium intake from the diet would be in chocolate. The rest would be in legumes, would be in grains, would be in vegetables of all kinds. So it's not, I mean, please don't be too scared by this. However, you might want to say, well, where can I get less lead and cadmium? Craft chocolate makers, basically. And part of the reason for this is when you're a big mass market chocolate maker, a lot of the cocoa beans are left to dry on the side of the road, where vehicles are driving by and there's vehicle emissions, and the lead then comes back down and settles onto the cocoa bean. So it's not in the cocoa to begin with. It just they get exposed to it through processing. The cadmium gets in there, not through that. The cadmium gets in there through the soil, and this is again where a craft grower can choose where to grow their cacao trees to avoid concentrations of cadmium. Whereas the industrial-sized growers, they can't do that. They can't just shift an entire, plantation. Whereas you can shift individual trees. So yeah, Lindt did really badly. Tony's did really badly. Tony's Chocolonely. Hugh, which likes to present itself as kind of craft chocolate, it isn't. They did really, really badly. But you know what? The worst. So what I'm not showing on screen is the highest in lead and cadmium together. Dun, dun, dun. Green and Blacks was one of the worst for lead and cadmium. And again, this is not my data, this is Consumer Reports, you can check it out afterwards. And one of the ones which were best, Taza. Here's Taza. Grown in Mexico, made in America, one of the lowest in lead and cadmium, and in my opinion, one of the best to actually enjoy. So maybe I'll split that one open in a few minutes. Okay, so, but the way you can avoid this again, choose craft chocolate. The other thing you can do really easy is just eat the chocolate after a mixed meal, because then the lead and cadmium basically are competing for absorption with other minerals that you actually do want to absorb. So if you eat basically a mixed meal with sources of calcium, iron, zinc and other minerals, which you just normally naturally do anyway, given when you look at these foods where you're getting it from, that will prevent a lot of the lead and cadmium from getting absorbed. So this is another way you can mitigate your intake and your absorption of lead and cadmium. So, that's it. Got a little bit of time for, not chocolate, just questions initially.
So thank you so much, Benjamin. That's absolutely fascinating. And now I'm really sad because you just mentioned my favourite chocolate there, and it's going to be high in lead. No, not that one. But anyway, we've got time for maybe one or two questions. So has anybody got anything they'd like to ask?
I mean, beyond the deliciousness of chocolate and things you said, if it's good enough for the mice to be injected, could we not get an IV drip? I think you referred to it, and once a month instead of a Myers cocktail or a blue methamphetamine or something, you get that as well for dessert.
Have you been watching Brian Johnson? Okay, that's the kind of thing that, so Brian Johnson is a famous kind of self-experimenter, millionaire who's doing everything possible to try and live to 500 or forever. It's the kind of thing he would do. You don't need to go that far though. You can just buy cocoa powder, which is literally just 100% cocoa solids. And you can also buy cocoa powder which has been specially produced for consumer, but to be very, very high in polyphenol count. So if you were really, really motivated to have the best possible polyphenol count, you could just go out and buy cocoa powder, which is being produced in a way to have the maximum polyphenol count. So you don't need to have it IV dripped inside you.
So the same rules apply buying the cheap £2 cocoa powder?
So if you buy, say, mass market cocoa powder, let's say Bourneville or Cadbury, it's almost definitely going to be alkalized. So it's almost definitely going to be Dutch or alkalized, which is going to reduce the polyphenol count. It's going to have been high temperature roasted, and also they'll produce it from, there's different cocoa varieties, and the most common industrially produced cocoa variety is something called CCM51, and it's bred for disease resistance and drought resistance and proliferation, but it's lower in polyphenol or lower in phytonutrients, and it tastes pretty bad, which is why you've got to add sugar and milk and other things to it, or vanilla, to make it taste good. A really good chocolate shouldn't need other things added to it to make it taste good. So if you've got flavourings like fruit flavourings or even vanilla in chocolate, it's a signal that was bad chocolate to begin with, otherwise it wouldn't have needed to be flavoured.
So what cocoa
I'm going to recommend, so with no affiliation at all, I'm going to recommend if you want the very best in cocoa and chocolate to look at Cocoa Runners. It's a company in the UK which is like a museum, an art gallery of craft chocolate. They're actually based not very far away from here in China Square, but those blue flyers there are for a free to attend Cocoa and Chocolate Festival, 11-12 October, which is where you'll find the very best cocoa and chocolate you could possibly buy. Like these ones I've got here, which we can try a little bit of after I stop answering questions.
Okay, so thank you so much, Benjamin. That was absolutely fascinating. Will you join me in thanking?